27. And that's up in 230 Prospect, where the Guild Harmon Center is. The Ku Klux Klan, 27. And that's up in 230 Prospect, where the Guild Harmon Center is. The Ku Klux Klan in Alabama social profile. And everything I learned about Mobile for the book I did called Slave No More, I began learning from Michael. And then Bill Devereaux, who's the current visiting Lamar Fellow, or Beinecke Fellow, one of those, is going to do a brown bag talk on February 8th called The Convalescent West, Redemption and Healing in the Post-Civil War Era. If you know anything about the history of the American West, you know Bill Devereaux is one of the most distinguished historians of the U.S. West. Well, we're very privileged today to have Douglas Blackmon with us. Doug and I got to meet last fall at a conference on Birth of a Nation, the film that was held at the New School in New York. And we had, if one can have a great time talking about Birth of a Nation, we had a great time, especially afterwards. Doug was born and raised in a small farm town in the Mississippi Delta, which has to be where his interest in the problem of race or race relations in the South would have begun. He's been almost 20 years now a writer for the Wall Street Journal. He's bureau chief of the Wall Street Journal in Atlanta. As I recall him telling me, his interest in this problem, this subject, neo-slavery in the American South in the late 19th, early 20th century, began in part by his writing, or through his writing, about business. Companies like J.P. Morgan, U.S. Steel, coal companies, mining companies, turpentine companies, lumber companies, brick and steel, and so on, in the South, and learning the ways they used laborers in the late 19th, early 20th century. He then wrote this book a couple of years ago, Slavery by Another Name, The Re-Enslavement of Black Americans from the Civil War to World War II. A stunning work. We've known something about that peonage, and we've known something about neo-slavery in certain forms in the last decades of the 19th century, but I don't think ever quite like this book shows it. And all sorts of reviewers and commentators have said that, and the Pulitzer Committee, of course, gave him the Pulitzer Prize. Just as an example of a comment, David Levering Lewis, this may have been a blurb or just part of a review, I'm not sure, said the book is, I quote, an American Holocaust that dare not speak its name, a rivetingly written, terrifying history of 6 decades of racial degradation in the service of white supremacy and cheap labor. Now, it is a book about convict labor, labor camps, business practices, and it is ultimately a book about real people, by their real names. I also found fascinating in this book the way Doug handles generations, the way in which the post-slave, the first freedom generations came of age, but also found themselves facing and experiencing forms of slavery as their parents had. So it's a history about business practices, but it's a history about real people as well. And he just told me that he's also Tiger Woods, in case we run out of things to talk about. Always ask about that. So please welcome Doug Blackmon.
Thank you. By his work, inspired by particularly certain parts of it, as I slogged through the material of the caricatured version of the Old South and the Deep South, and the Civil Rights period as well, of good black people and terrible white people and saviors from the North, the sort of simplified trichotomy of perceptions of racial history and social history through all this period of time boils down to this incredibly oversimplified version of events, and a lot of historical scholarship falls into that as well, in my view. So it was always a great admirer of David, as someone who saw through all of that and in really profound ways and enlightening ways opened up the mind of whites and the invention of whiteness and these underlying forces that shaped these events, which all of us have some level of interest in. But it is with a bit of trepidation that I come here as well. It's another thing I always say in academic settings is, as someone who is really not a traditional scholar, and a guy who came out of the basic public schools of a little town in Mississippi and got a degree in English from a little liberal arts school in Arkansas, but has spent most of my adult life and a good bit of my youth as well toiling as a newspaper reporter, mostly writing things that may or may not have had an audience along the way, and certainly even more likely weren't remembered for very long. Like that my Tiger Woods story was probably going to be remembered for long. It's pretty good. But so coming into any academic setting I do that with a bit of trepidation, but particularly into one where there are scholars of such renown and such accomplishment and who clearly do know about many of these things. I keep waiting in these settings for someone to ask me the great stumper or to pull on the strand in front of everyone that makes the whole thing fall apart. Maybe today will be the day that happens. But I would like to deviate, because this is a different kind of audience. I hope I'd like to deviate from my standard stump speech, which I've been giving for the past year and a half about the book, and so I'm going to forego this thick sheaf of notes that I usually work from, and when I get worked up on can last an hour and a half or more. Instead, I'm going to work off of this one tiny set of notes. But what I'd like to do is to talk a bit about what the book is, Slavery by Another Name, the Re-Enslavement of Black Americans from the Civil War to World War II. Because I have come to terms with the harsh reality that every author eventually comes to terms with, and that is that not all of you have yet completed reading my book. And so I'll tell you the gist of it, and then read a bit from it, something very short, and then talk for a few minutes about why I wrote the book, and which is something I'm often asked, because of my background and what I do in my day job. But also how I wrote it and researched it, particularly the ways that I approached the book that are different, I think, than much historical scholarship, traditional historical scholarship. And then also what it means in terms of the value of history in the present. And particularly now I'm sort of fascinated with the question of, I'm fascinated as we observe in American society this discussion that's sort of percolating in the background around race, which seems to start with a lot of people arriving at the conclusion that because we have a black president now and because the nation has accomplished this once unimaginable thing, that somehow that means that the tortured past in terms of race and history is something that merits less discussion, that perhaps it's time to abandon the classic narrative of racial injustice and the victimization of African Americans, and that African Americans, but it's time for African Americans in particular to put that behind them somehow and stop talking about things that happened in the past. And I find that a fascinating discussion, and so maybe we'll talk a few minutes about how this terrible, terrible, grim story, why it does still have value, and why there is currency to understanding these things. And inevitably, some of that will also get into, to some degree, my beef with conventional historical scholarship. And I say that with great trepidation in a setting like this.
Only the graduate students need to worry about, not us.
Exactly fine. But so, in terms of the gist of the book, it's the story of how after the Civil War, after the passage of the 13th Amendment and the other constitutional amendments were intended to guarantee citizenship and legal rights and voting rights for African Americans, how in the face of all that and the defiance of all that, in the Deep South, slavery was resurrected. It wasn't exactly the kind of chattel slavery that existed before the Civil War, though in many places it resembled it very, very closely. And after a period of time, depending on the exact location we're talking about, came to be almost indistinguishable from the kind of slavery that had existed before the Civil War, with the one exception of that it was not a slavery that could be passed down, typically passed down from one generation to the next. It was not a slavery you were born into, but a slavery that individuals were forced into. In a sense, they were born into it. And it operated within the legal system and outside the legal system. But it was based on fundamentally on a perversion of the judicial system, which inevitably the judicial system in the South was revolutionized after the Civil War. It had to be revolutionized after the Civil War because obviously the laws of the pre-Civil War laws, the laws of the Confederacy, all had to be reorganized and redone, and the status of the Negro had to be determined and codified somehow in the legal system. And so, but in the course of that revolution, what also happened was a discovery on the parts of whites in the South that the legal system could be used, in fact, to create a new kind of coerced position for African Americans in the South. And so the result of that was that over a fairly long period of time, 15, 20, 25 years, depending on different things happened in different ways at different times in different parts of the South, but effectively in the 1870s and 80s and 90s, the laws of the South, of all the Southern states, and the judicial processes of the Southern states were all radically changed in ways that created this extraordinary web of legal jeopardy for African Americans that effectively criminalized black life. Now, the laws that were passed didn't say these laws applied only to African Americans, but again and again and again, misdemeanor statutes and a whole array of other legal provisions were passed which were only ever, or very rarely ever, enforced against whites and almost exclusively enforced against blacks. And these were laws which made it a crime for a farm worker to seek employment from a person other than their current employer without permission from their current employer. So the effect of that was if you worked for a landowner and that person was abusing you or cheating you, or there simply was a better opportunity working for another person or on another farm nearby, it was a crime to go and seek employment from that person without permission from the first guy. Now the implications of that are fairly obvious. That's a law that was almost never enforced against whites, but it was enforced thousands and thousands of times against African Americans. And the result of it was that some laborer who's being beaten, or not to be melodramatic about it, but who's being beaten or starved, or his wife being sexually abused by the landowner, a whole array of things that could be happening, and an African American man would seek employment someplace else in violation of that law and find himself then arrested by the sheriff, declared to be guilty of that statute, and then find himself dragged back to his former employer, but now working as a prisoner, literally in chains, no longer even as an ostensible free laborer. It was against the law to seek employment from someone else. It was against the law not to have a job. All the Southern states resurrected the vagrancy statutes, which had existed in some form in American and English law for centuries, but had become obscure and largely archaic by the 19th century. But the whole notion of vagrancy as a criminal offense was resurrected in a very aggressive way in the South, and those are statutes that are still a part of our lives today in terms of enforcement against homeless people and such as that. And so it became a law not to be able to prove at any given moment that you were employed. It was a crime to sell cotton or any other produce of your farm after dark. Odd law. You couldn't sell things. The reason for that was to prevent a farm worker or a sharecropper from selling the produce of their work to anyone other than the man who owned the land. So the idea was that if you make it illegal to sell things after dark, then it's impossible for someone to leave their farm with the produce of the farm and sell it to someone else who might be offering a better or a more just deal. It was a crime to walk beside a railroad track. It was a crime to talk loudly to a white woman. It was a crime, obviously it was a crime to have sex with a white woman. And the adultery statutes of the South were all, in reality, racial adultery statutes, and overwhelmingly enforced against African Americans and not against whites. A whole array of these laws, which pierced into the daily lives of almost all African Americans in the rural Deep South, created this web of jeopardy that was almost unavoidable. In many respects, it's a bit like what happened in Nazi Germany in a much more organized and precise way in the early and mid-1930s.